So I want to begin with a few perspectives to introduce our time together. First, Mikhail said this earlier, but for our conversation today, we are assuming some knowledge of the basic fundamentals of collective impact. We talked with the board a couple of months back, and that's what we talked about. This is not that conversation. So if you were looking for that conversation, you might want to, skip off to someplace else. The genesis for what we're really going to talk about today came from a conversation, I think this summer, with Mikhail. And Mikhail, when you asked us sort of what are we thinking about at the Collective Change Lab, and I shared a perspective with them that I'm going to share with you now, and it was something to this effect: that so I've spent a decade doing collective impact work, and it is a powerful approach to population level change and systems change. And we have third-party research at this point that indicates that across a variety of issue areas, from economic mobility to education to health, that collective impact is actually having an impact, right, at a population level. It's being adopted and has been adopted over the last decade by, really, thousands of practitioners around the world. This is a global community at this point of people doing collective impact. All of that said, my perspective is that as we go forward in collective work, in collective change work, and collective impact work, we need to do the work differently than today if we want to move from incremental change to transformational change. And it's not only about doing the work differently. For many of us, particularly in the Western world, it's about reframing our worldview of how social change actually happens. So for me, I'll take you on my very quick sort of story of my journey as it comes to social change. I've been doing social change work for 2 decades. There's really been sort of 3 major evolutions of my thinking and understanding of social change. And I wonder if perhaps some of you have gone through this evolution. The first was running a global consulting firm called FSG. We did strategic planning for individual organizations, foundations, government, business, and nonprofits and NGOs around sort of what their strategic plans would be. And we were working with individual organizations who inevitably had the aspiration to, quote unquote, change the world, to, improve graduation rates in education across, the entire nation, the entire country, or to improve access to healthcare, at sort of a global level. And the reality is that no one organization can do that, right? We all know that. And so that was the first evolution of the thinking, was to say, we've got to move, if we want to think about systems change and population level change, we've got to move from thinking about individual organizations to thinking collectively. That's what spawned collective impact. Now, as I was doing the work of collective impact and came more deeply involved in collective impact work, it was clear to me that, what we were seeing by and large was, I always say, if you want to change the system, you get the system in the room. By that, I mean, you get representation of the system. And that's really what we try to do with collective impact. But we were coming together, and FSG and I were facilitating this work, and people were really excited to get together and come up with ways they could collaborate. And they were coming up with programmatic solutions. They weren't thinking at that sort of higher systemic level. So the second evolution for me, first was single to sort of, collective set of players. The second was thinking from program to system. Now, the third evolution that I've undergone recently, and many people got there more quickly than I did, is that by and large, the way that we're doing the work is in a very rational, logical, linear way. And that if we're really going to get to transformation, we need to approach our orientation needs to be much more relational in nature. Now, what do I mean by relational? Well, it's basically about focusing on and training our attention to the qualities, to the natures, to the ways that various parts of the system relate to each other. And that it's really about cultivating processes to lead individuals and collectives in human development. It's all about human development. Now that's sort of, even that sounds technical to me. So if you want a shorthand definition of what we're talking about, it's about fostering systems that love. Fostering systems that love. And if we really want to get to transformation, that's got to be our orientation. So our conversation today is going to be in 2 parts. The first is we're going to want to engage you in your understanding and your belief of how important it is to make this shift from relational to rational. You've got to make that decision on your own, but we can help sort of have a conversation about that. And we're going to do that principally through looking at the 3 collective impact areas that you all are involved in. And the second part of the conversation is, let's go deeper on the relational orientation and just start to unpack that. And I think if there's any sort of thing I wish we could do today, we're not going to have time, is we're going to talk about that in an intellectual, cognitive way and not in an experiential way. And at the end of the day, you have to experience the relational dimension of this. So we're not going to get to that level, but at least we can start a conversation. The last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to turn it over to Katherine, we're going to go back and forth today, is that I imagine some of the messages that you'll hear today, some of you may be attracted to, and some of you may be very uncomfortable. And some of you may both be attracted to the message and feel very uncomfortable. Any of those feelings are legitimate. They're totally legitimate. So I invite you, as we get into this work, to feel your feelings. What are you feeling? How does it land with you, so to speak? Okay. And the last thing I'll say on top of that is just that, think about this. If you think about these 3 evolutions in the journey, and if you buy into, and we'll find out today if you do, that there needs to be a shift from the rational to the relational, or a rebalancing, think about this as the first conversation. You're not going to walk away from today and sort of totally transform your work, but at least we can start to have that conversation and see what you all as an organization think about this. So with that, I am going to hand it over to my colleague, Katherine, and we'll move on.
This is a wonderful quote from the feminist writer Marilyn Fry. And about 40 years ago, she wrote this beautiful piece about systemic oppression. And she likened it to being a bird in a cage. If you look very closely at just one wire in the cage, you cannot see the other wires. Only when you step back, when you stop looking at the wires one by one and take a macroscopic view of the whole cage, that you can see why the bird does not go anywhere. And then you will see it in a moment that the bird is surrounded by a network of systematically related barriers, no one of which would be the least hindrance to its flight, but which by their relations to each other are as confining as the walls of a dungeon. And I think John and I this is a very powerful image to hold in your head, this notion that it's never just one thing holding vulnerable people or marginalized communities back. It's always multiple things, multiple bars, right? All at once. And this is really the complexity that we're faced with when we think about systems change. Now, I have been working in the world of systems change for many years as well. John is, of course, a tremendously respected thought leader in the field. Several years ago, he and colleagues, including Peter Senge and Mark Kramer and others, set out to really help to bring a lot of clarity and simplicity to what all the practitioners, be they social entrepreneurs, collective impact leaders, nonprofit leaders, and others that I know feel are very abstract and dense and complex definitions and terms that really just don't resonate, with their day-to-day experience. And so the definition that sort of John and colleagues espouse, and which I think many of you might be familiar with, and which I can certainly attest from where I sit, has been widely adopted by many practitioners in the social sector, is this one: shifting the conditions holding a problem in place. This definition comes from Social Innovation Generation Canada, and I find it to be very evocative and very practical, because these problems are not accidents. They are being held in place by conditions. And so thinking about your work as systems change means thinking about shifting those conditions. And then that leads us into the question of, well, sort of what do we mean by that? What conditions are we referring to? And as many of you know, and I think are familiar with, the water systems change back in 2017 with this definition in hand, John and his co-authors really set out to sort of define those conditions for shifting systems in a way, again, that's useful for practitioners. You're all busy people. You need not dense, academic literature, but what can we really do with this on Monday morning? How do we integrate this into our work? And so John referred to his journey and those evolutions of thought in his journey, and he's going to share a bit more about that evolution with us in just a moment. But these are the 6 conditions, and I have seen this. I think some of you may have already integrated this into your theories of change or into some of your working documents. But I just want to sort of, for whatever it's worth, also offer many other organizations that I know of or have advised in the past or am on the board of, have really used this framework, find it a very useful framework for thinking about not only the system that they're operating in, but very strategically in terms of their day-to-day operations. How do they think about, plan, and communicate the way that they're shifting these 6 conditions? And this frame goes by several names. The upside down triangle, some people call it, or the upside down pyramid. And sort of regardless of what name you give it, it's helpful for many practitioners to try and get their arms around this, again, what can be a very dense and abstract sounding concepts. And it's also really interesting, I think, to think about it in terms of these sort of levels of explicitness, levels of seen versus unseen, levels to some degree to which you can assign quantitative KPIs also. And I just think that it's useful to spend a moment on each of these. And at that first level, the structural level of systems, this is seen. This is kind of known and understood, kind of by everyone. And these are policies and practices and resource flows, right? What communities, what issues are getting resources and what aren't? What are our practices and ways of working? What sort of our policies? What are the laws on the books? What's the regulatory framework? This is, around that particular system. So this is explicit, and these are sort of the structures of systems. At the next level down, sort of semi-explicit, and I like this term, the relational. Here we have power and relationships and connections. And John, I'm sure you can speak to this more in a minute, but it's semi-explicit. The way I interpret that is because it's not necessarily seen and understood by everyone. Some people in the system see the power dynamics very well and understand who the influencers and the power players are and how those dynamics play out. But it's not widely known and widely understood to everyone, nor are necessarily the relationships and connections and how various entities and institutions and individuals are connected with each other and are in relationship with each other or not. Maybe there's mistrust, dysfunction, territoriality, turf battles, etc. That's also very common in the systems that we work in. People tend to think of relationships as soft stuff, but they are anything but. Many of the most impactful and catalytic efforts that I know of are doing the work of being the so-called connective tissue or the glue that brings either as a convener, a neutral convener, an honest broker, or in some other fashion is with intention building relationships between key actors in that system, particularly organizations, again, as I mentioned, that have never previously been in relationship, but certainly should be. And then at the deepest level, the implicit level, because this is sort of not seen or known. It's hard to label them. It's hard to name them and really articulate what they are our mental models, our belief systems. So what is it that we believe about child welfare or about homelessness or any of the other systems that we're working in, about the communities that are most impacted by the system? Criminal justice system is a good example. And here there's this interplay between narrative and mental models. And how the stories that we tell and the narratives that are shaped by our stories feed our mental models and vice versa. And Jean's going to give a beautiful example of that. So again, here, the structural level and the notion that the transformation really comes through the deeper levels of shifting systems, that one can work at the structural level, but it's really by working at this deeper level here that you're going to get sustained change. Another phrase that John has coined is system snapback. And it's this notion that some of you might even be operating in systems where you're feeling some resistance or where that system is snapping back. But it in a sense, the players want to revert to, sort of the previous equilibrium. And really only by working at these deeper levels of relationships and power and mental models are we going to shift that system into a new equilibrium and prevent that system snapback. So I'm going to turn it over to John in just 1 second to give us an example here, particularly of the role of mental models. But I think that, the keynote that I'd like to end on is just that these second and third levels here are often given short shrift for a variety of reasons. And that's really what we're keen to explore with you all today. And to understand your views. That's part of what you're going to discuss in your breakout groups. Why do you think that is? We have some hypotheses that may or may not be, sort of valid in the Israeli context. But for a lot of the practitioners we talk to, one reason is because people just don't believe it's important. Relationships, oh, that's soft. Another reason is because people might believe it's important, but you have a lot of constraints in which you're working. Your boss, your board members, your funders, your key stakeholders, the constituents that you're working with, sort of might not share those views. And a third reason is just really like how do you change mental models? That sounds like a really big ask. And how do you transform power dynamics? So I know that this isn't an exhaustive list, and certainly there are other reasons why that's the case. But I thought I'd just offer a few observations based on all the conversations we've had with practitioners of why it's so difficult to try and work at these deeper levels of systems. So let me pause there for now, and John, turn it over to you to talk a bit about this example, and of course to add anything that you would like, and to talk about this example and about the shifts in values that this requires.
Thanks, Katherine. So there are many ways that people are engaging in social change. Collective impact clearly is one, and as we talked earlier, we've had some success with that. What I guess an observation as we think about a holistic look at systems change is that if you look at sort of I'll call it the more formalized mainstream of the social sector, my observation is that 90% of the attention goes to that top level when people think about systems change. And the reality, as Katherine just discussed, is that you can't move a system long term. You can't build sustainability into a new equilibrium into the system unless you're working at those deeper levels. I think what's interesting is if you think about movements in the United States, think about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, or more recently Black Lives Matter, which really is a global movement at this point. They don't start at the top. They start at, let's call it the bottom left corner. They start with relationships and mental models and shifting those to shift power dynamics to then shift structure. And in my mind, that's a much more sustainable way of thinking about systems change. Love is love. Some of you may be familiar with that expression. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but a movement that was very successful in the United States and other parts of the world was the marriage rights movement for LGBTQ over the course of 20 years leading up to 2015, where in the United States, same-sex marriages became legal in the law of the land, so to speak. What's interesting is, while that movement was very successful at actually working from the bottom left up and thought about how do we shift the mental model from being about sort of a very rational equal rights approach to a love is love approach that people could relate to. If you know somebody that you love, don't they have the right to love others and to be married to them? Even if their sexual preference is different than yours. That was very successful, but there's actually a backlash going on against that in the United States and other areas of the world. And why is that happening? The snapback that Katherine mentioned is happening principally because of these deeper levels of change. So they're really hard, they're really messy, they're non-linear. We can't think about them in terms of logic models or even sort of scripted theories of change, but we need to move into this, these second and third levels, what we call the cultural levels of systems change, if we're actually going to think about wholeheartedly, changing a system. Katherine, next slide, or whoever's in control of that. So I wish we could spend a lot of time on this. I'm just going to put this here for you to look at. This comes from Terry Cross, who is a Native American in the United States, and he was sort of looking at dominant or linear values, dominant culture, Western culture, versus non-dominant relational values. So in effect, comparing the United States, but also around the world, sort of the more Western orientation to a more indigenous orientation, and what is prioritized, what is valued. If we want to transform our systems, we need to, it's not that the left isn't important, but there's a way sort of underbalancing of or overbalancing of linear values, and we need to shift more into a dominant value framework. So the reality is that, while Western culture doesn't do a great job today of helping us understand what it means to work in a relational way in ways that can't transform us, there are some non-dominant frames that do. And certainly, I'm guessing many of you have heard of restorative justice and truth and reconciliation. And we can look more broadly at the wisdom traditions, Eastern and Western, and also indigenous practices that, sort of aren't relying on what we in the West over the last 500 or 600 years have, done in terms of sort of creating our culture and our set of expectations. And so, what we've tried to do is, about a year ago, we looked sort of broadly across sort of these non-dominant frames, because, the question that we were trying to ask is, how do you support individual and collective transformation? And these frames tend to have incorporated and think about sort of this question of how do you create the conditions? Remember, we're talking about conditions for change. How do you create the conditions for individual and collective transformation to happen? And what can we learn from traditions and frames that have asked that question? And you can never totally guarantee transformation. You can't transform somebody else. You can't transform a group, as much as maybe some of us would like to sometimes. I try to transform my children, but they do it on their own. But you can create the conditions to sort of increase the odds that transformation can happen. So that's really what we're talking about, is how do we increase the odds that collective transformation can happen? And as we looked across these various different frames, they really at their core, because they're really about, and they're based on, in some cases, tens of thousands of years of human development. How do we in a human development way support transformation? And at their core, because they're all about the same thing, which is human development and potential, they tend to have sort of 5 qualities that support transformation. And so that's what led us to the frame that I think is on the next slide. And so I'm going to talk about each of these. You may have seen these on our website. These are sort of 5 interrelated qualities. You can think about them as access points to supporting transformational change, to supporting the work around those 2 deeper levels of systems change that we talk about. I'm going to just give you some perspectives on each of them, just so you can hold them in your mind. And that's the thing, you're going to be able to maybe hold them in your mind. Maybe I'm not, I won't be able to get you down to holding them in your heart, because you actually do have to experience these. And I'm guessing many of you do have experience with these. So this is not about sort of me being the expert and telling you, but really me sort of maybe helping direct where you can put your attention if you really truly are interested in transforming the systems that you work in. So we'll start first with focusing on interchange as well as outer change. So Katherine and I have a colleague who characterizes interchange in this way. It's really a deep examination to remove the fog from our eyes so that we can see ourselves and each other more authentically. And so it's about asking questions like, who am I? What are my biases? What are my blind spots? What are my defining ideologies, conscious and unconscious? How do I present? So this is a process of what's known as inner work, and it requires practice. It requires doing it over and over again, having a practice and doing it over and over again. Basically, what you're trying to do is build your own capacity for staying present and exercising reflective thinking. And I can't think of sort of 2 things that are more important for people working within a backbone organization and collective impact efforts, if you want to be effective, than building your own capacity for staying present and exercising reflective thinking. Another dimension of inner work in the context of social change is that you must be able to understand your own role in the problem you are attempting to address. So the problems out there are related to the problems in here, right? So I'm going to give you a personal example. When I began to do more collective impact work and facilitation, I didn't really feel like I could get the group down to the heart of the matter. And my initial focus was, well, it was their problem and not mine. But then I sort of turned the lens on myself, and through reflection, therapy, et cetera, I realized that part of the problem was that I'm conflict avoidant. I have been from an early age. And I wasn't allowing the perspectives to deepen because I wasn't allowing enough time or space for differing points of view to surface. So the good news is that, I've worked on that. I wouldn't say I'm the world's best, but I'm better able these days to support people getting into deeper conversations. Now, I will go so far as to say that if you want to do social change work, you will never be really effective unless you do your own inner work. Now, I'm not saying you have to do your own inner work. I mean, you can go work in the for-profit sector, you can go work on a farm, a self-sustaining farm and not do any work. And I'm not saying you have to do interchange work, but if you are to do social change work and you want to be effective, I'm saying it's really a necessity. So why don't we, a couple of thoughts on deep relational work. This came out, at least in our small group, but sometimes we forget that social change is social. I mean, sometimes literally we forget it's social. And this came up in our group. Relationships are the essence and the fabric of collective change. And the key here is to intentionally structure ways and spaces that build true empathy and compassion in connections. So not just connections, but empathy and compassion. This is not soft stuff. The very quick example I'll give you in education in the United States, there was a man named Tony Bright who researched what it was that drove performance in 100 elementary schools in Chicago. He and his colleagues researched that. Their measure of improved performance was increase in math scores and reading scores. And what they found that the #1 thing that actually improved performance at the student level was not necessarily curriculum or better teaching, but it was when the relationships between the students and the teachers and the parents and the administrators were strong. They ended up calling this relational trust. And when relational trust was high, that actually drove student performance. So as Katherine said, this is not soft stuff. Another way to think about relational work is it's about increasing collective resonance. I mean, you all talked about different actors in the room that are coming from very different orientations and reasons why they're going to be there. What we're trying to do is improve the collective resonance so they can get to true innovation and not just to coming up with new programs, but how are we actually going to shift the system. You know, individuals can resonate, organizations can resonate, communities can resonate. Let's talk about healing, cultivating healing, cultivating a space for healing. So Katherine and I are doing a lot of work in this realm right now. Individual and collective trauma are forces to be reckoned with in any social and environmental issue we work on, any issue. And yet the topic of trauma, at least in our observation, is almost nowhere to be found in the mainstream dialogue about social problem solving. And it's the human condition to have been wounded. We've all experienced trauma in our life. For me, a major trauma in my life occurred when I was 4 years old. I was standing in close proximity to another 4-year-old friend. They took a bad fall and they died. I carry that into my adulthood in terms of guilt that it was somehow me who caused that death to happen. You know, I've gone through therapy. I've, you know, in a better place in terms of sort of understanding the trauma and also linking it to my avoidance that I talked about earlier of conflict. I don't like to see people get hurt. And I carry that deep in my heart. But now that I'm more aware of that, I can turn that to healing that, you know, particular trauma and think about how I can use that creatively in an innovative way in my work. Every community we work with on every issue, there is a history of trauma. Understanding that trauma, because trauma, you know, it's a universal condition, but the way in which trauma occurred is unique to the context. And we have to understand that if we're going to do work. And we have to figure out how we support healing in the work if we want transformation. There is no transformation without healing. And it is the human condition that we all have trauma that needs to heal. It's the collective that we're focused on in this work as well. And so what Katherine and I are focused on is, you know, this question of how do we support collective healing as we think about this work. And we've got some really interesting models like restorative justice. So we're not starting from scratch, but thinking about this in the context of, you know, collective impact efforts, you know, there's additional work to be done. Next. Power. Much talked about. I'm sure you all talk about it a lot. We're much more aware of it than we used to be in terms of the challenges to achieving transformational change, but no lasting transformation happens without sharing, without power dynamics changing. I'll give you just two perspectives. If we have time in the sort of the dialogue later, I can go in more depth, but one thing, you know, two perspectives that I think are helpful as we think about transforming power is one, sharing power doesn't mean losing power. And in fact, you can share power and actually gain power. We can talk about examples of that later if we have time. Two is that power transforms when values shift, okay? And values shift when relationships between players in a system shift. And we need to focus on creating the spaces and structures for that to happen. Last example, or last quality. Welcoming serendipity and a sense of the sacred. So this is sort of like, in some respects, the hardest one. You know, I'm worried, I'm fearful when I put this up and when I talk about this, is like people are gonna say, oh, he's like super religious, or oh, he's a you know, fanatical nut. The reality is, you know, again, from a worldview standpoint, it is only in the West that we actually separate the sacred from actually doing the work of supporting people and supporting the environment. In other cultures, that's not the way, you know, they think. So when you don't even need to sort of be religious or spiritual to actually sort of bring the sacred into the work. We're going to talk about that a little bit with Roca. You'll hear some ways that they do that. This is really about sort of opening our hearts so that different, ideas can come in, and that we can recognize that there's a universal source, there's a higher order of intelligence, whatever you want to call it, God, that we can ask into the process. And the fact that we in the Western world feel funny about that, that's our problem. In other cultures, that in fact is done. And as we think about, the ability to actually solve the problems on our plate these days, it's imperative that we actually invite in that universal source. So, big cognitive download, not experiential, I recognize. But perhaps as we move into the case, and I'm going to turn it back to Katherine to facilitate a conversation on the case, we can start to get into at least some of these and talk about what this looks like on the ground.